All right, let's see. Adding requirements example. We're still back on our housekeeping situation. So the termination notice gave the reasons for the termination, multiple poor ratings as detailed in the modification, said the termination was effective in 2 weeks. And this is something that you will want to deal with. You could have an extreme situation where you have to terminate immediately, but usually if you do a termination, it isn't going to be immediately because you have to have some provision yourself for what's going to happen to maintain services. So in this particular instance, we said the termination was effective in 2 weeks. So the vendor was supposed to give us that same good quality of service for the next 2 weeks because we had to go out and do a new procurement to get a new vendor. And this was much easier because since this was a small facility, we were dealing with small procurements in this situation. Now, it wouldn't have been if it would be like a 5-year contract, but we didn't have to do a 5-year contract. We went out and made it within the confines of a small procurement and had the thing done and awarded and a new vendor in place within 2 weeks. So, and that was a bridge contract, the small procurement, to hold us several months until we did a multi-year contract for a new contract. And even that multi-year contract was below the Board of Public Works threshold, so we could go ahead and award the thing and get it in place. But it just illustrates what we did in that situation to deal with where we did not have good specifications. Through the modification, we got better specifications and used those specifications to take an action. We're continuing with no contractually provided remedies. Actual damages. We've talked about liquidated damages. Now we will talk about a little bit about actual damages. Except for situations for which liquidated damages have been specified, an inherent aspect of any legitimate contract arrangement is that a party to the contract that is harmed by the other party not upholding its contractual obligations can seek monetary reimbursement for the damages, meaning the loss, expense, whatever it is, that the one party incurred because the other party did not perform as it contracted to do. So we have a contract, you're supposed to do something, I'm supposed to pay you, and I expect to enjoy some kind of value from you doing it. I'm willing to pay for it. Your non-performance, if it causes me harm beyond even what I was going to pay you, I can go and collect actual damages. And we mentioned in the planning class the situation that occurred not too long ago with the State Retirement Agency, where they had a vendor that they had used for something like 7 or 8 years for actuarial projections about how much money they should charge to us for retirement benefits so they would have the ability to pay and things of this nature. And they ended up determining the vendor had, through faulty actuarial calculations, projections, that kind of thing, actually understated both how much retirement would owe to us as employees when we retired because of their projections, and they had undercharged, I guess, employees for the benefits to the tune that after the contract was over, they filed a claim against this vendor, and it went to the Board of Contract Appeals in January of this year, January 2010, and they got a judgment of $72.9 million against the vendor because of their combination faulty actuarial projections. And the vendor, not wanting the prospect of paying $72.9 million, appealed that verdict by the Board of Contract Appeals to Baltimore City Circuit Court. And in July, the Circuit Court eliminated $34 million of the damages. So they upheld, I think, $39 million of damages, or 33 point something, and said 34 was not justified. So at this point, what is standing at this point in time was the vendor still supposed to pay around $33 million to State Retirement Agency, which is far, far more than they were paid for the work they did for the retirement agency. And the vendor supposedly is still deciding whether they will appeal the circuit court decision. They can appeal it to the Court of Special Appeals. And so that's just showing that in this case, the retirement agency went after actual damages, and they proved through a lengthy Board of Contract Appeals hearing that they were entitled to supposedly $73 million. Then it went to a court, and the court decided that the Board of Contract Appeals had erred in part of the judgment, but still you got $34 million on the table that this vendor still supposedly owes the state. So that's far beyond. So that is the harm that was done by one party, because the other party supposedly, without, I guess, grossly in error, made these wrong calculations and wrong projections, and it caused harm by them doing that. So actual damages, that's what were pursued. That's what they got a judgment. They still haven't gotten the money. So that's the next step. Judgment is one thing, getting the money is another thing. Although agency contracts may have a generic clause that says the agency can pursue damages or seek to be made whole in the event the contractor does not perform as required, without any such clause, an agency can still pursue damages against a vendor, because this is a matter of general contract law. The way an agency pursues damages against a vendor, and probably this should say one of the ways, because the one way is simply withholding money, but the other way, particularly when a contract is over, is by filing a claim. And I mentioned that earlier this morning or earlier this afternoon, whichever I did mention it. Beginning with a slide later, claims contractors file against agencies are discussed. When an agency, so we're going to discuss later when a contractor files a claim against agency. Now we are talking about when the state files a claim against a contractor. So this is when we do it. When an agency files a claim against a contractor, it is the contractor that replies to the agency's claim or accusation. And believe me, this is a reversal of circumstances. If you're a procurement officer, you know you're usually on the receiving end of protests and claims, and you're the one that has to answer these. This is a situation, if we file a claim against the vendor has to answer it. A state-filed claim shall be in writing to the contractor and the procurement officer. And that's going to sound strange, because the first inclination is the procurement officer is the person who files the claim with the vendor. In reality, that is not what happens. It is going to be either your attorneys or your contract manager that files the claim with the vendor. And they provide a copy, the claim to the contractor, and they give a copy to the procurement officer. The claim against the contractor will explain the basis, the amount of the claim, or the performance or other action the vendor is supposed to do. So either how much or what they're supposed to do under the claim, and the time within which the contractor must provide a written response. For a state-filed claim, the contractor may ask for additional documentation, again, the opposite of what we do. Usually in a claim, we may ask the vendor to give more documentation. In this case, they may ask us to provide more documentation to substantiate the claim. They may offer to settle. The vendor may make an offer to us, and it may go negotiate back and forth as to, we ask for $100,000, they offer $50,000, we come back with 60, they come back with 58. It can come back to that, and we can negotiate a settlement with the vendor, the same as we can negotiate with them if they filed the claim. Or the vendor can deny the claim. Yes?
Is there a statute of limitations on when you can file a claim, either the state or the contractor?
I am not aware of any statute of limitation about when the state can file against the vendor, and there is a limitation of when the vendor can file a claim, and that limitation is 30 days?
I would say 30 days.
30 days after the basis of the claim is known or should have been known. Now, so that comes into question, when should they know or should have known what the basis is? So they have, 30 days to give notice of the claim, and then they have an additional 30 days to actually file the claim. When we get to the one on the contractors, we'll give the time frames. But for the state, I'm not aware of any time frame for the state to a limitation. And I don't know when this judgment is just made, I don't know when that contract's even over. So I don't know whether we're coming to fact, and I think it again stemmed from the legislative auditors pointing out something, so I think it probably was years after the contract was over that this was done. So no, I'm not aware of any. If to the contractor, let's see. If the contractor, I don't know why I said to, if the contractor fails to respond or provides an inadequate response to the claim within the stated time frame, or denies the claim or the relief sought by the agency in whole or in part, and there is no negotiated settlement, because again, we can always negotiate by mutual agreement what we're going to accept as being okay, then the procurement officer issues a recommendation decision for review by the Attorney General and approval by the reviewing authority. So basically, the procurement officer has to decide whether the state's claim has merit. And I actually had to do this within the past year. And it was the first time I was ever involved in a claim against the vendor. And I had to be told what the procedures were myself, because I'm like, what is this now? You're going to ask me whether I'm okay with filing this claim, well, not filing the claim because the claim was filed, but going to the Board of Contract Appeals for a claim that the state had made against a particular vendor. And the reality is, when I had to make a decision, I sat down with the program people, and it was a rather involved claim, and went through all the aspects. And there were certain aspects I said, I don't see where we have the right to do that, to get that. And so when they found out that I wasn't willing to withhold it, then that comes off the table. And the other one I said, yeah, I think the vendor should have done that. I certainly will uphold that. And we went through point by point and got to the ones that I was okay with. And then they amended their claim to the points that I was all right with, and they basically said to the vendor, now, if you want to negotiate, we will negotiate, and if you do not negotiate, then the procurement officer will be requested to file a claim with the Board of Contract Appeals. And the vendor actually came and negotiated, so we negotiated a settlement in that case. But supposedly they did it because they believed that without that negotiation, a claim would be filed with the Board of Contract Appeals that they would have to defend at the Board of Contract Appeals, and at that point they could lose the whole amount of the claim. And of course that's the incentive for negotiating a settlement, that they're not potentially will get it for less than the entire amount of the claim. And the same as with the protest or a claim by a vendor, the decision by the procurement officer has to be approved by the Attorney General, and the reviewing authority is usually the agency head or the designee of the agency head. And so if we have their approval, then and the vendor denies the claim and there's no negotiated settlement, and the procurement officer and agency head say, okay, file it with the Board of Contract Appeals, that would be the next step. And then the Board of Contract Appeals will make their decision. And that's what happened in this retirement situation when they got to $72.9 million. In this instance, no.
No, the one that you reviewed.
That's what I'm saying, no. And I even asked that myself. And the answer was that it involved no more money, there was no change in the contract, there was no more money involved in payment of the contract. It was simply almost as if we wouldn't have paid the money to begin with. That if they would have invoiced and would have said, no, this is not within the purview of the contract, and wouldn't have paid it, that wouldn't have been something that was subject to Board of Public Works approval. So our assistant AG said the settlement did not have to go to the Board of Public Works, because it was not in that matter any change in the contract, any change in amount, any change other than we shouldn't have paid the money to begin with.
So it wasn't a reduction of cost?
It ended up being a reduction in cost for us. We got money back that we otherwise wouldn't have gotten back. But it wasn't a change in the contract. It was just that if there would have been, I guess, strict adherence to the contract terms, we wouldn't have paid the money to begin with. No change in what the contract called for. And that's the instance, what Gary is talking about, any change in a contract that produces a monetary value of more than $50,000, either increase or decrease, needs Board of Public Works approval. So if there would have been a decrease in a contract activity, a change that caused even a $50,000 decrease, the Board of Public Works has to approve that. And there have been such actions when you have this thing called budget reductions, when you have problems and you have to go back to vendors and say, for instance, we need to do a 5% reduction in costs or something like that. And so you go to your vendors and say, all right, we need to reduce your contract cost by such and such amount. If in doing that there's more than a $50,000 reduction, that reduction has to go to the board. So, all right, let's see. Both the agency and contractor, so if this is filed at the Board of Contract Appeals, both the agency and contractor can produce any additional documentation pertaining to the claim, and either party can request a formal hearing by the Board of Contract Appeals. Ultimately, unless the agency withdraws its claim either because a settlement is reached or because it may believe its claim is no longer justified because of the newly available information that it learned from the vendor defending itself, the Board of Contract Appeals will render a decision about the claim. The Board of Contract Appeals can uphold the claim, i.e. the vendor is supposed to pay $72.9 million. Or deny the claim. Nope, state you have not proven your case, we do not agree the vendor owes you any money. Or remand the claim back to the parties for additional dialogue based upon its decision on some aspect of the claim. Excuse me. Maybe there's a key point of contention, and the Board of Contract Appeals gives a ruling on that issue. And now that there's a ruling on that issue, that changes the dynamic of, does the vendor owe us money? Maybe they owe more, maybe they owe less. But now that we've had a decision, instead of the board saying uphold or deny, it's I've decided this factor, now the two of you go back and talk some more and see if you can work it out. So that's another possibility. The board may render a decision on a major point of contention, and once having done so, the parties may be more willing to reach a settlement on the remaining issues. A decision by the board may be appealed to an appropriate circuit court by either party. And I mentioned in the retirement one, in that case was Baltimore City Circuit Court, that the appeal went to by the vendor whose name was Milliman. The state has only had the right to file a claim against the contractor since 2004. So I mentioned earlier that we've only had over a short period of time, 6 years. Before then, only a contractor could file a claim against the state. The state either had to file a lawsuit against a contractor for breach of contract, actually go to court right from the very beginning, or withhold monies due to the contractor and force the contractor to file a claim against the state to seek payment of the monies withheld. Historically, few claims have been filed by the state against a contractor, both because it's only been 6 years now where it can even happen, and because it's usually easier to withhold monies and make the vendor file the claim than to file the claim by the state. But the state will file a claim if the basis for the claim isn't known until after a contract ends and final payment has been made. That was the case with the retirement agency, with the one I just talked about. It was after the contract was over. Since now there is nothing to withhold in terms of payment to the contractor, and usually this situation happens after an audit has been completed with a finding of overpayment. But depending on the circumstances, a threat of a claim being filed against a contractor may be a very potent weapon to help convince a vendor to perform all aspects of a state contract. It's another one of the proverbial arrows in the quiver that you can use to try to get contract performance. So here we're going to have an actual example. And I don't know why, but this is another one from the Walter P. Carter Center. Like I said, I used to almost live at the Carter Center. Security contract at a facility. The vendor has responsibility for all security. They had 2 to 4 guards on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this was back in the 80s, late 80s, something like that. And the vendor continually monitored a central alarm station for open doors. So when you went into the Carter Center and went into the lobby, there was a, I don't know, what do you call it, the command center. And you had all the alarm panels. And you had someone who was required to be seated there 24 hours a day monitoring all those panels and all those lights that told them if there were fire alarms, if there were doors open, anything of that nature. And there was always a guard at the front entrance. And depending upon the hour of the day of the week, you might have had a third or a fourth guard at any point in time during the day. So always at least 2, and sometimes as many as 4 at one time. Okay, so that's the situation, and $4,000 worth of equipment disappears on a weekend. It was there Friday at 5 o'clock when the people left, and Monday at 8:30 or 9, whenever it was, and they come in, it isn't there. And $4,000 back in the late 80s is worth, I don't know, $10,000 or so now. So it's a lot of stuff to walk out on a weekend. And so the first thing that happened was the contract manager of the Carter Center, Boulware, I can't remember his first, do you remember a guy named Boulware? What was his first name? Not that one. He was a football player. Anyway, this guy was a he was the maintenance supervisor, very conscientious. So he called the vendor's home office, and it was the Abacus company, and the contract manager was Carol Dixon at that time. So whatever Boulware called Carol Dixon and said, okay, we got a problem. We got this $4,000 worth of equipment that was on one of the upper floors, 5th floor, something like that, and disappeared. So I'm going to withhold money from your invoice because I want you to pay this $4,000. And Carol Dixon of Abacus said, wait a minute. I don't agree that we owe you $4,000. I don't agree that we were at fault because this equipment walked out, something like that. And what he asked for was for a joint, if you will, tour of the facility between himself, the maintenance supervisor, and me. I'm the procurement officer. And so we scheduled time to go down there, and what he did for about an hour and a half was take us through every part of the facility and supposedly point out every conceivable way in which someone could have left the facility with equipment and it wouldn't have been their fault. Except that every single instance that he brought up of how something could have happened, there was something in the contract specifications that made them accountable for that action. And when I say accountable, meaning that either they were required to have a guard. For instance, he went to the loading dock and said, okay, there are these huge hampers that are used to take out the laundry. And these things are like 4 foot by 2 feet, and laundry is piled like 2 feet above it, and there's stuff that could be hidden in those hampers that are brought down from the upper floors. But the contract specifications said that each time the laundry was to be taken from the facility at the loading dock, a guard was to accompany the hampers. The guard was to stay at the loading dock for the entire duration. The guard was to check the contents of the hampers. So basically, we're saying the guard is there to make sure nothing inappropriate happens. And that same example applied everything that he brought up. We said, wait a minute, either they were supposed to do something or there was supposed to be an incident recorded in the log at the front desk. In other words, if a door alarm goes off, and you know when you're in a facility and it's occupied, you can't lock the doors so that people can't get out in a fire or emergency. So you can't lock the doors, and he kept saying all people had to do was take this thing and walk out the door. And we said, okay, but if they did, there would be an alarm that went off at the panel, and there should be a notation in the log that a door was open, what time it was open, what time the guard responded to see why the door was open. And so we checked, we said to him, okay, that's fine, let's go to the log and let's check to see if there's any recording of any incidents. and there were no recording of incidents. So the last thing we got to was, and let's see. Incident note, among the possible not responsible scenarios, in fact, there are several sets of doors leading to the outside can be opened from the inside as emergency exits. Each of these emergency exit doors is connected to an alarm panel with a security control post. Each time one of these doors is opened, an alarm lights and sounds on the panel. When the dorm alarm alerts on the control panel, a guard is supposed to immediately go to the door to check why the alarm went off. Each time there is a door or any other alarm alert, a notation is to be made in the daily security logbook of the time and date of the alarm, when the guard responded, and what was found by the guard. There were no open door incident notations the weekend of the theft. So, okay. So if your guards were doing their duty, they should at least have recorded in the logbook that a door was open. There's no recording. So even if it was open, your people weren't doing their job by recording that it was open. And if you assume they were doing their job, then nothing was open. So either way, your people either did their job and there was nothing to record, or they didn't do their job and should have recorded something, and why didn't they? Now, the last thing we checked, and this was almost an afterthought, was, okay, and going along, each time we got to some of these double doors, we opened the door and saw how long it took for the guard to respond to investigate. And depending on where it was, third floor, etc., it would take 5 minutes or less. And the guard got tired of each time running up. And believe me, they knew when their boss was on the grounds. So they were very responsive. Probably more responsive in this situation than they would have been in a normal one. But again, each time a door was open, then a guard would appear 3-4 minutes later and would say, and the question would be, did alarm go off at the front panel? Yes, that's why I'm here. And so the supervisor for the vendor, Carol Dixon, said, okay. And we keep noting that supposedly the doors are, the alarm panels are working, that kind of thing. We said the timeliness response was no doubt spurred by the presence of the home office contract manager and the knowledge by the guards of the tour and its purpose. The last of the doors we checked was a double door. With double doors, the door on the right opens, so we'll have to tell this whole story so you get the benefit of the situation. The door on the right opens. The door on the left can only be opened if the right door is open, and while the right door is open, 2 latches are opened on the left door, and you can probably visualize this. So you open the right, and when you have the right open, on the left, there are 2 latches, and you have to open these, and then you can open the left door. Okay, so when the last door was opened on the right side, on a whim, the procurement officer also opened the latches on the left door, opened the left door, and then shut both doors with the left side latches open. So we noted, the vendor's contract manager radioed the control post to verify the panel was showing the doors were closed. And so he verified that the control panel was showing that the doors were closed. And after verifying that it showed the doors were closed, since I had unlatched the left door, I pushed the left door open. And no guard appeared to investigate the open left door. After about 5 minutes, the vendor manager radioed the control post and asked if there were any alarms showing on the panel. The answer was no. So apparently the left door was never connected to the alarm panel, so nothing alerted when only the left door was open. Immediately, Carol Dixon said, aha, that's how the theft could have occurred. That someone could have simply unlatched the left door. They could have discovered this somewhere along the way in time and unlatched it, and they could have gone in and out, and that would explain why nothing is recorded down at the central command post, etc. It's not our fault. So we're not going to pay the $4,000. I had a little different view of that. The vendor manager, that's what I just said. Thereafter, the left door could be continually opened without incident and used for entry or exit for any number of reasons, including the $4,000 theft. The vendor's manager said this proved his firm shouldn't be liable for the theft, would you hold the firm liable? And you can't speak, because I'm sure you know what you would do.
Because aren't the guards supposed to be checking the doors to make sure they're latched?
Aren't the guards supposed to be checking the door to make sure they're latched? Sounds plausible. Anybody else?
Or video cameras, aren't they monitoring the whole?
There were no video cameras. And again, this was 20 years ago. I mean, they had things back then, but that would have been a facility capital investment, and the facility didn't have the money to do it. So we have one person that says, well, shouldn't the guard be responsible for checking the doors and seeing they're locked? Anybody else have any feelings on the subject? Would you hold the firm liable? Would you still, despite the vendor's contract manager saying, don't withhold the $4,000, we're not responsible, do you still think they are or are not responsible? How many think you would, how many would withhold the $4,000? How many would say, nope, that's a good explanation, good enough for me? One, two. How many would talk to your assistant AG and ask them what they think about it? Two of them. How many say, I haven't the faintest idea, glad it's not me that has to make a decision? All right, well, let's see what somebody said back then. We're giving you a little more detail now. The vendor was required in the specifications to do a complete security survey of the facility at the start of the contract and annually thereafter, and note anything that the facility should fix. The vendor had been at the facility for more than 2 years when the theft occurred. The vendor never noted the unalarmed left door. Does this change, are you now willing to state a preference of what you would do in this situation? Does this change anything in terms of whether the vendor is liable? Can you deduct the $4,000 from the payment? So how many now think that you would deduct? How many think, nope, still the vendor has a good story, I wouldn't do it? Still have one, and how many still not going to go there? Well,
That was good that was built into the specifications, that they should go through and check out this system that they were going to inherit. I mean, they were dependent upon this system to let them know when something was open and something wasn't open. I mean, it just makes sense they would have checked the system out.
I would say we would have to make daily rounds of all the buildings. Because it could.
Well, that may not have discovered the problem.
well, so in other words, you're agreeing that perhaps it's a little incredible that after 2 years, the vendor still has not discovered that that left door was never on the monitoring panel?
I have to wonder what else they didn't discover.
You might have to wonder what else. I mean, we found nothing else on that tour, but gee, we didn't check every single part of the facility. And there, so the decision of the procurement officer, somebody with some strange name that starts with a J and ends with an L. The decision of the procurement officer was that no matter how the theft occurred, the vendor was liable because the unalarmed left door had not been noticed for 2 years. The alarms worked when all other doors were open during the inspection tour, and there were no incidents in the daily log to indicate anyone opened any emergency doors the week into the theft. Vendor was informed of this decision. What was done? The $4,000 was deducted from future invoices as damage for the theft. The vendor wasn't happy. They're never happy losing money, but did not contest the deduction. Because the vendor had been given an opportunity to try to explain why it shouldn't be held liable, but only ended up showing a failure to note the left door situation, there really wasn't any valid grounds to refute the vendor's responsibility and the appropriateness of the damages deduction. Now that's my conclusion. There was no valid grounds for them to refute it, so we withheld the money. So does that sound like a good decision? Okay, now let's see. As fate would have it, about a year later, the same vendor, Abacus Corporation, the same contract manager, Carol Dixon, different facility, Patterson Avenue. About a year later, after the prior example, and about the same vendor, $9,000 of computer equipment disappeared over a weekend. It was from, I think, Health Services Cost Review Commission. Much of the time at the Patterson Avenue office, there was only one guard on duty. That guard is required by the specifications to make rounds of all 5 floors of the Patterson Avenue building. The guard is not allowed to lock the front or back doors while away from the main door. Because when people are in the building, you cannot lock it so that people cannot exit from the inside. Fire safety issue, people have to be able to get out. Okay, so the vendor is required, bless you, is required to make rounds. There's only one vendor, can't lock the front or back door. There's only two ways in, front door, back door. The guard at the front door cannot hear the alarm if the back door is open. There's an alarm on the back door, but if you're sitting at the guard desk at the front door, you can't hear the alarm door. And we know this because Carol Dixon and I took this tour of Patterson Avenue after the 9,000, same as we did at the Carter Center, for him to try to explain why they were not liable. And so these are all the things we determined. There is no alarm panel to provide alerts. Can't hear it, nothing there to tell me the back door is open. In its initial written security assessment, in its initial, same requirement, they had to give a security assessment of the facility. In its initial security assessment, the vendor had identified, number one, you don't have enough guards. Number two, guard can't hear the doors. Open, shut, can't hear the door. Number three, they identified a number of deficiencies in the requirements. The security assessment with the noted deficiency was provided to the state contract manager. Due to lack of funding, none of the major deficiencies was corrected. Is the vendor liable for the missing equipment?
Nope.
So how many say no?
Nope.
How many say yes? Anybody say, don't know, not going to go there? What was done? The same vendor contract manager from example one was contacted the possibility of invoking damages, such as example one was mentioned. The contract manager immediately said, not responsible, and they would file a claim if any monies were deducted from regular payments. Damages were not assessed because of the differences between this situation and the one in example one. So I'm the contract manager in both situations. One situation, I firmly believe the vendor was responsible. We applied liquidated, not liquidated, actual damages, $4,000. The other situation, they could have been responsible. The guard himself could have been the one to take the equipment. We had no way to know. And so we would not have been able to prove anything and just said, just sorry. And well, maybe that was a costly lesson for the state, but the fact is we couldn't pay for more guards. We couldn't pay supposedly for the alarms or anything else. And so in that case, we were just out $9,000. So that's examples of actual damages. No contract provision, no liquidated damages, just actual damages.
It's surprising that there were more thefts. People knew, hey. go
And
in.
maybe there was theft all the time, but not enough that it actually got to my attention. Don't know.
That must have been a big haul.
And maybe it was between having good people in the building, and maybe they were doing a really fantastic job of guarding despite the deficiencies. So maybe that's why there weren't more. I don't know. All I know is I had one situation, and in one case at Carter Center, $4,000 deducted. Another thing out at Patterson, nope, I'll go with the vendor on that one. But it shows, again, what the procurement officer is supposed to do. You don't just say the state is right. You don't just say the vendor is right. You determine what is the appropriate action at any point in time, what is the most defensible, the most fair, and if you do that consistently, that is the way that you help get good contract management. All right, moving on. Let's see. We're going to talk about continuing problems with the contractors. We're moving on past actual damages now. The agency contract manager should implement the following progressive steps. So if there are continuing problems, not just isolated, but something has happened and it continues to happen, so what do you do? Steps 1 and 2 should be consistent with the external communication slides when we deal with that, either yet today or on the third day. Step 1, and this is where you've already mentioned this to the vendor a couple times and now you have to go beyond because things aren't getting better. Send a letter to the contractor's manager. So after you've done perhaps some preliminary steps, now you're starting to get more formal, send a letter to the contract manager. If the problem continues, Send a letter to the contractor's manager with copies to superiors of both parties, state personnel and the vendor's supervisors. Gary would send it directly to the president.
I call him first.
Gary would call the president. Gary wouldn't mess with these things. Call the president first time, tell him to get their act together.
Come in and see us.
Come in and see us. And presidents love to do that. They love to have problems identified about their company. But it does get action at times. So, send a letter. The contractor's surety, if there is one, and the procurement officer. And this is something we're going to tell you. You need to remember if there is a performance bond involved, payment bond, but in particular a performance bond, that if there are continual problems with the vendor, and if you're now starting to put those problems in writing, you should advise the surety that you're having problems. And if you're a nice guy and don't do that, you can get to the point, if you ever try to go against the bond and try to collect on the value, that the surety will repudiate your efforts to collect on it. They will say, you didn't let us know there were problems, you didn't let us take any action to try to help alleviate the problems, we're not going to pay you. And so if you're getting to this point and there is a surety, copy them on written correspondence. If there is a problem escalation chain, as we described on last Monday, if they provided one, you can follow that. And maybe that's the way, instead of these two procedures, because they've already told you what the escalation procedure is. Step 3, and we're not saying this is what you do in every situation, but this is a logical sequence. Convene a meeting with the procurement officer, project manager, and perhaps project management team, this is internal, to determine the next steps. So what are we, the state, going to do about it? If you have to now decide, are we going to take like step 4? With appropriate approval from the procurement officer and other officials, withhold money or in particular damages as spelled out in the contract, and if necessary terminate the contract either for default or convenience depending on the circumstances. So this is a progressive step that you might employ. Remediation plan, otherwise known as a corrective action plan, what this is, and it is what it says. We're asking the vendor to take corrective action to remediate its non-performance or subpar performance of the contract. An agency may require the submission of a remediation or corrective action plan if a vendor has missed or appears likely to miss important deliverable deadlines. So number 1, it can be where there's actually has been deadlines that have occurred and what was necessary to be performed wasn't performed, or maybe you didn't even get to the point that there is a missed deadline, but all the information available, meetings, reports, surveys, whatever it is, indicate that if things continue as they're going, it's going to be missed. So you don't have to wait until there's an actual missing of a deadline to take action. If you have all available evidence that the vendor is not going to meet it unless something gets kicked up a notch, then you can do the remediation plan before a deadline is missed, because typically you don't want to have the deadline missed. You want to have the vendor do what they're supposed to do. Let's see. A communication to the contractor by the agency requesting a remediation plan should detail the contractor's lack of performance relative to the contract requirements, i.e. you're going to point out in the contract where it requires whatever action supposedly they have missed or appear likely to miss, and what they either haven't done to this point or the, what you're using as the evidence that they apparently will not get to where they have to be by the required time frame. Direct the contractor to submit a plan by a specific date. So by a given date that will be in your letter, you're going to have them come back with this remediation plan to get them back on the required time frame to meet deliverables as required. A remediation plan may be requested when the contractor has not missed a deadline or objective, but reports, meetings, etc., evidence that without increased effort is likely to miss important deliverable deadlines or objectives, or even the total project completion date of outcome, or have missed one or more deliverable deadlines and is in danger of missing additional ones. sometimes a remediation plan is requested even in addition to the assessment of liquidated damages. So even with liquidated damages, we can still, if the vendor is not performing, request a mediation plan in addition to. So it's not mutually exclusive. A remediation plan request could be a prelude to a termination for default outcome. In other words, we're giving you the opportunity to get back on track. And you can either say directly, or you can imply, or can you just have it in the back of your quiver, so to speak, that you are seriously considering termination for default if they do not get back on track, if they do not get back on the time frame that they are required to be on to complete the project as needed. I.e., there has been documentation of insufficient performance and maybe some prior, perhaps informal communication with the contractor that it has to invest more effort into the contract to get to the level of performance that it should be at this stage of the contract. But now there is a written request that documents the major shortcomings and directs the contractor to submit a formal plan by a specified date, with that plan being subject to agency approval. You always want to make sure that you say you have to approve anything of this nature, whether it's a startup plan, whether it's a closeout plan, whether it's their own contract management plan, whether it's a remediation plan. Just them giving it to you isn't enough. They have to give it to you, and you have to pass judgment on whether it seems to be indicating enough effort to get back on track. And if it isn't, you tell them, I'm still not satisfied. The plan generally will require the identification of one or more of, we want you to change the people. We think you have the wrong people on the project. Perhaps you need someone with more experience or more skills, more training. Perhaps it's the personnel that are the problem or part of the problem. Maybe it's not the quality, but it's the quantity. So maybe you just have to add more people, or maybe it's a combination both of quality and quantity. And sometimes they can do that either by themselves or just bring in subcontractors. So you want to see their activity. Perhaps they have to bring in other than personnel, institute a new process, new software, new equipment, new sites to do something, contractors for other than personnel. Increase, they have to bring something more to the table than they have to this point in time. Whatever additional resources or procedure or personnel changes the contractor says it will devote or make to properly perform the contract are to be done without additional cost. We're not saying that we want you to do this because we want you to do more than what you committed to begin with. We're saying we want you to do this to meet what you have said you were going to do before. So we're certainly not going to pay you more money for you to simply do what you should have been doing from the very beginning, because you're the one who responded to this solicitation, you're the one that quoted a price, do what you committed to. These activities are being undertaken, that's what I said, because they're not performing or seemingly will not be able to perform, so we do not pay the contractor more money to do what it has already obligated itself to do for a previously specified price. The plan will generally require identifying not only the new resources the vendor will bring to the table, but when they will do so. When are you going to bring 2 new people? When are you going to change out the contract manager? So we can say not only whether the indicated additional resources are sufficient, but they're going to do it at an appropriate time frame, like within the next 3 days, within a week. Or we're going to do something in 3 days, something a week from now, something 2 weeks from now, so we can see when everything is supposed to be done. And we can then hold them to whether they do what they now have said they're going to do by various time frames. If the agency, and have them explain how the additional resources at the level and time specified will assure the contract will be performed as required. So have them explain to you why what they're now planning to do will get things back on track. And even though they're going to do this, you don't have to believe them. If the agency is not satisfied that the plan will get the contract back in compliance, the agency needs to so state and direct the plan to be revised and resubmitted by a firm date. We don't believe that you're still applying the appropriate resources So we want you to go back and we want you to give us a revised remediation plan within 3 days. By 5 o'clock on Friday, November 19th. We want a revised remediation plan back in my hands. If the agency is still not satisfied with the plan, it may begin default proceedings. If you don't believe they're going to do it, you may decide, now we're going to go after default. But you're giving them the opportunity to come and make up for past failings. So, remediation summary, be very specific about what, who, when, how, consequences. What has to be done, who has to do it, when it has to be done by, what are the standards, and what are the consequences if it's not done. So that's a remediation plan. Any questions on that? Okay, let's see. Change management procedure. I've mentioned this a couple times. Now I'm going to mention it in more detail for hopefully not all of 15 minutes, but let's see. For certain types of contracts, frequently IT ones, to some degree it is appropriate to decide what work the contractor is to do in the future based upon the work it has done to that time. This type of contract is typically awarded on a time and materials or labor hours basis, either entirely or partially, with a known overall objective and how to commence the contract. However, it is anticipated that the contractor will need to do some level of investigation or discovery of existing conditions or needs, what works and what doesn't work, etc., in order to recommend how next to proceed at a given point in time. So they have to go and they have to do an assessment of what generally is called the what is, what currently exists. And once you decide what currently exists, then you have to give recommendations of now what should it look like? What should it be in the future to make things better, more efficient, lower in cost? So giving the recommendation, obviously they can't give us prices and they can't give us a firm commitment of what they're going to do if they have to do an investigation to even figure out what it is they have to do in the future, and not just what they have to do, but what they're going to recommend to the state that the state agree that should be done. So there has to be this change management where they give this recommendation and someone's going to tell them, okay, proceed, or no, we don't think you have given sufficient justification, or no, we understand why you said that, but there are reasons why we can't do that, or we don't want that to be undertaken, so don't do it. And you haven't said this, but we really would like you to go do more analysis of this aspect instead. You're kind of pointing them with where you want them to go. So this is where you have to manage what the vendor is doing, what you're authorizing them to do, what you're directing them to do, and this authorization process is what you would call change management, so you know at each point in time what they are now required to do and thus what they can bill to do. Let me speak some more on this. In such a situation, it is crucial for the contractor to be able to present his findings and recommendations to the contract manager, a specific individual, or to an agency change management committee that has the collective knowledge and authority to assess the contractor's work and either approve the next step that the contractor recommends or to tell it to proceed differently. I.e., to a degree, the scope of work of the contract is made up as it goes along. It is crucial that there be a process in place for this to be guided and approved in an orderly fashion. It is also crucial that there be a process to document each new deliverable, and I quote, put that in quotes because what you now authorize them to do with the next step now becomes the deliverable they're supposed to do. It wasn't in the contract to begin with because the contract couldn't say what the deliverables are except for the very high level, go in, do an analysis, give recommendations, but we're fleshing this out by this change management procedure where they say, I think I should do this, and the committee either says, yes, go ahead, or no, do this instead, and documents it so both parties know now what the vendor's supposed to be doing and what they can bill for. Let's see. In terms of exactly what is to be performed, within what time frame, perhaps with an approved level of effort, i.e. expense, and we're going to talk about the DC example. Although we're not going to, this is a situation that was mentioned in overview and it's mentioned in another class as well. And basically, it was mentioned in planning. And basically, this is a situation where Washington, D.C., from 1992 to 2000, tried to implement a human resources system and spent $20 million to implement the human resources system. And in 2000, they pulled the plug, decided that they couldn't get there. The $20,000 basically was down the tube. It was wasted. They had nothing to show for it. And what they did was in 2000, they went back to the system they had been using prior to 1992, that if I remember, and if you go to slide 867 or something like that, which you don't have yet, it will tell you that they spent something like an additional $4 or $5 million to reinstitute the program that they had prior to 92, which by that point was, I think, 19 years old. And so they basically had spent $25 million to get to a non-working system. And after the fact, when they did the analysis and the auditors went all over it to try to figure out what happened, they had a couple quotes that are back on approximately slide 867 that said something to the effect that it was just a compounding of the wrong vendor to do the project and the wrong people inside to manage the project, and a complete lack of documentation of what the vendor was supposed to do. So supposedly, Washington, D.C. could not recover money from the vendor because they couldn't point to anything that the vendor was supposed to do because no one kept records of what the vendor was supposed to do. So supposedly, you got $25 million to show for nothing. Not a good story, and that's what we're emphasizing. We don't have that happen here in Maryland. If we have a change procedure, we document each thing that is authorized for the vendor to do, so we do know if the vendor is doing what we authorize or not doing. If this type of contract does not have a process and structure in place to allow for controls over what the contractor is doing at any point in time, it might be easy for the contractor to expend time and effort, hence expense, on activities that the agency is not fully aware of, may not want. And by the same token, there may be things the agency does want that aren't being done. If you're not keeping the controls over you, the agency, directing the vendor on what to do and what not to do. And without such controls, it may be difficult to determine if the contractor was authorized to proceed with a given activity, or exactly what it was authorized to do or required to do for a stated price, etc. In other words, when the contractor bills for work performed, should it be paid because you authorized the work, or should it not be paid because you didn't? And if you don't have documentation, you're going to be in a dispute with your vendor because they're going to say, I've sent you the bill, I'm entitled to the money, pay me. And so if you don't have something to say they didn't do what they were supposed to, or they went out on a limb they weren't supposed to go out on, and you can't document that they violated something, you may have them filing the claim, and even if you deny it, you might lose at the Board of Contract Appeals because you can't prove that they weren't doing something they were supposed to do. And you shouldn't be in that situation. For instance, an agency may want to obtain a single integrated IT operating system to replace multiple independent, ancient, i.e. legacy, IT programs that do specific narrow activities, are not compatible with each other, cannot interact, are not well documented as to how they have been programmed over the years. And I know this is a really unusual situation that would never occur in the state of Maryland, that there would ever be just systems that have grown up over the years that have no interaction and different functions, and we don't even know what all is out there or what they do or what the code is. We would never have that in Maryland. So this is just an imaginary situation.
Hypothetical.
Yeah, hypothetical. You're right. The contractor selected for this project will need to determine, number one, all the existing standalone stovepipe type of single-person systems, what each does. So they have to go out and find out how many things are out there. And we have 67 different agencies in the state. Obviously, we have major, large agencies, and we have a lot of small agencies. But if you're talking about the state and you want something being done consistently, you got to go to all 67 of those agencies, big or small, and find out what do they have in place. And what they have in place, what do they do? And what is the code, what supports each? What are agency current business processes, and which of them need to be enhanced by the new system, and which of them needs to be changed to take advantage of the expected capabilities of the new system. So that's what needs to be done. As the contractor pieces together all the in-place systems and makes recommendations for how to replace them, it needs to, number one, document what it found. So now it's going to go out and it's going to have a concise identification of all the in-place systems that do myriads of different activities one at a time. It needs to explain why its proposed new procedures are appropriate. So when it gives you a recommendation to integrate all these things, why is it giving the specific recommendation it's giving? Why is it the best way to do this integration, give you the best solution to what you want? Needs to obtain the required agency approval for it to proceed as per its recommendations or make revisions to its recommendations and proceed as revised or focus its efforts differently. But this scenario shouldn't happen if to this point there was proper monitoring. Okay. Shouldn't get to this. If you have been monitoring the contractor's performance, if you've had meetings and reports and things of this nature, even though this is a possible outcome, that you're not going to tell them to proceed, and you're not going to tell them to proceed with some minor tweaking, you're going to basically say, nope, we don't agree with where you've been going at all. We want you to do something completely different. That means there's a lot of wasted effort, and you should have known before you get to a recommendation point that they're going down the wrong road. So hopefully you won't get to that. Under a contract for public, okay. Probably shouldn't go there at this point. Let me see. All right, I'll do those two, and then we'll pick up. These are examples. Change management example number 1. Under a contract for public relations, advertising the contractor is to create various themes, taglines, etc. And after approval from the agency, host a focus group to test the reaction of the group to the themes, approaches, mock commercials, etc. If the focus group doesn't like or understand the themes, etc., the vendor has to go back and redo their approach. If they have tried it and they've come up with what they think is wonderful, and the requirement is you go to a focus group and see what they say, and the focus group basically says, we hate it, even though the vendor has spent effort developing those initial approaches and commercials and various things of that nature, the expectation is now they will exert more effort to come up with something different. And they will have documented through this procedure that what they came up originally seemingly will not work and they have to do something different. And just this second example for an IT development contract, the contractor is to develop a system to accomplish a result and subject that system to performance testing to validate, make sure it does what it's supposed to. If the testing reveals problems, the contractor must fix the problems and test again, or if there are no major problems, maybe redo. If there are major problems, maybe redo its system entirely. So you test it. If it works, you give the approval to proceed. If it doesn't work, you tell them, go try it again, and you document the efforts, you document what they are supposed to do, so when they bill, what you're allowed to pay, what you should pay, and what you shouldn't. And with that, we will start on tools to manage performance on day 3.